The transport shuttle touched down with a muted thud, and a wave of pale dust rolled across the barren surface as the hatch opened. The cadets stepped out into the blistering daylight, each shielding his or her eyes from the fierce glare of the planet's oversized star. The instructors waited on a rocky ledge slightly above the landing site, watching the group gather with the same stern expression that always signaled a difficult test ahead. Elena stood near the front, her gaze fixed not on the instructors, but on the shimmering horizon where the heat distorted the air into trembling ribbons. She felt the warmth instantly cling to her skin like a living thing, and understood that this planet was dominated entirely by its sun. She also understood that any rule involving fire would take on a different weight here. When the lead instructor activated his amplifier, his voice cracked sharply through the hot wind. He announced the rule for the trial with a flatness that suggested he expected panic, or at least despair, from the cadets. No fire on this planet. None. No sparks, no combustion, no thermal ignition of any kind. Every flame will trigger a toxic atmospheric chain reaction. A murmur passed through the group as several cadets exchanged uneasy glances. The instructor continued by lifting a sealed nutrient pack. Your provisions consist of raw roots, raw stalks, and unprocessed protein slabs. You will survive 24 hours without cooking. No exceptions. Elena listened without moving, her arms crossed loosely over her chest, her posture strangely relaxed compared to the others. The rule sounded absolute, but to her it also sounded oddly specific. There was no mention of heat in general, only of flames. The prohibition targeted combustion, not the transformation of food itself. She kept her expression neutral, unwilling to reveal the spark of interest ignited inside her mind. Around her, the alien cadets already looked defeated, imagining themselves chewing on bitter roots that their species normally boiled or steamed to avoid stomach cramps. A reptilian cadet beside her, his scales dull in the daylight, already groaned quietly as he tried to swallow a raw sliver of stalk from his ration pack. Elena noted the reaction and stored the information away. These cadets needed heat. The instructors believed no fire meant no cooking. She suspected they had underestimated what a human could do with a sun like this. After the briefing ended, the instructors dismissed the group to disperse around the designated survival zone. The terrain was mostly flat, with pockets of cracked stone, sparse thorn shrubs, and scattered metallic debris from old academy drills. Elena walked slowly, taking careful note of the shadows cast by even the smallest objects. The sun sat high enough that her own shadow was barely more than a dark smudge beneath her feet. She crouched, ran her fingers along the hot rock, and felt how impossibly fast the heat seeped into her skin. This planet did not merely warm surfaces, it saturated them. The energy pouring from the star was relentless, steady, and far stronger than anything she had seen on Earth. She lifted her head and studied the sky, observing how the light never flickered, never shifted. It was pure, focused, and dependable. She realized she could treat it the same way an engineer treated an open flame, only cleaner, safer, and allowed by the rules. While the other cadets chose places to hide from the heat, or simply sat in misery trying to gnaw through the stringy plants, Elena began a methodical examination of the environment. She pressed her boots into the soil, discovering how the upper layer was loose and dry, but beneath it the ground compacted into a clay-like foundation capable of holding shaped pits. She took a fragment of metal from an old storage crate, brushed off the dust, and observed how quickly the sun's rays heated its surface. Within seconds, the metal became too hot to touch. She dropped it with a small, satisfied nod. If she could reflect that level of heat, she could concentrate it. If she could concentrate it, she could cook anything the instructors had given her. She moved farther across the clearing until she found a cluster of debris littered across the ground. Among it, she discovered several sheets of emergency insulation foil, shredded along the edges but still usable. The reflective surface gleamed so brightly that she squinted as she gathered the pieces in her arms. She noticed several poles from a broken equipment tent, each still straight enough to be repurposed. She also found a cracked visor from an old helmet whose curvature sparked an idea the moment she picked it up. The visor bent the sunlight into a narrow beam that scorched the patch of soil beneath it. She smiled softly. The instructors had banned flames, but the planet itself was offering her something far more powerful. Once she gathered the materials she needed, she moved to a spot where the ground formed a gentle, natural bowl. She cleared it, smoothing the surface with her hands until she could see where the sun would strike most directly as the afternoon progressed. She knelt in the center of the bowl and began arranging the foil sheets, testing angles and adjusting them inch by inch. She worked in complete silence, ignoring the puzzled stares from nearby cadets who wondered why she refused to retreat into the shade like everyone else. To them, the trial was about enduring discomfort. To Elena, it was about understanding conditions. She secured the first makeshift reflector by planting the poles firmly into the soil, tying the foil around them with thin strips she tore from her ration pack. She adjusted the curvature with a precision she learned from years of watching her father use solar reflectors during mountain expeditions back on Earth. Her hands moved confidently despite the harsh light beating down on her. When she stepped back to observe her work, she saw the sun gather across the foil in a clean arc before narrowing into a concentrated point. The ground at that point began to darken almost immediately. She placed a single tuber there and watched as the dry skin cracked under the heat. Steam rose slowly from its center. Several cadets gasped from behind her. One stepped forward, his expression shocked as he pointed at the steaming tuber. Elena met his eyes briefly, then turned back to her makeshift oven without saying a word. She was not interested in theatrics. She was interested in proving that rules only held power over those who lacked imagination. She lifted the tuber carefully with a piece of fabric and examined the soft interior breaking through the outer shell. It was cooked, not by flame, not by ignition, but by pure solar heating. The realization settled over her with a satisfying calm. She understood now that she could accomplish far more than a single baked tuber. If she multiplied the reflectors, shaped deeper pits, and layered the insulation correctly, she could produce different heat zones, ranging from low, steady warmth to intense, searing temperatures. She could cook for herself. She could cook for the entire platoon. She could transform the whole trial into a demonstration of human adaptability so complete that even the toughest instructor would be forced to acknowledge it. Elena stood up and wiped the sweat from her brow as the sun continued to blaze overhead. The rule had been meant to restrict the cadets, to force them into discomfort and survival desperation. But she felt no restriction at all. She felt opportunity. The planet had given her a sun strong enough to replace every fire humanity had ever relied on. She only needed to build the tools to harness it. And she would. Not out of defiance, but because problem-solving was the most natural thing she had ever known. As the day stretched forward and the cadets continued to struggle with their uncooked rations, Elena quietly began planning the next stage of her solar designs, knowing the real trial was only just beginning. The cracked tuber still released a faint curl of steam as Elena set it aside, but she no longer paid attention to it. Her mind was already moving ahead, calculating angles, shifting variables, and adjusting an internal map of possibilities. The intensity of the planet's star fascinated her in a way nothing else at the Academy ever had. It possessed a steadiness she had only seen in controlled laboratory lamps, but this star delivered its energy freely, relentlessly, and without a second of fluctuation. She wanted to understand it fully before committing to building anything larger than the first reflector. She needed to know how it traveled, how quickly it moved, how sharply its angle shifted across the sky. So she stood in the open for several long minutes, watching the sun's slow progression and feeling its heat slide along her face as the shadow under her feet shifted shape. She had always been perceptive with these things. Even as a child, she had memorized the behavior of sunlight during long mountain trips with her father. She could tell the time of day from the temperature of a heated rock, estimate the position of the sun from the fading of light on her hand, and feel the coming of cloud cover before seeing it. Here, the sky offered no cloud cover and no atmospheric softness. Everything was pure exposure. That purity made the star easier to predict. Elena took several steps back to observe how the bowl-shaped patch of land she had chosen changed its illumination. The reflective foil she had already placed glimmered sharply, and she realized she needed to adjust the structure to compensate for the sun's slow drift. If she built multiple ovens, she would need each one to capture light for several hours without requiring constant realignment. She knelt and traced a line in the dirt to mark the shadow of a thin pole she stuck upright into the soil. She planned to monitor its movement. Every survival technique her father had taught her ran through her mind in an orderly stream, each piece of knowledge fitting perfectly with the next. She remembered how he showed her to track the sun's motion with nothing more than a stick and patience, and she now applied those lessons with renewed precision. After several minutes, she made a second mark where the shadow had moved. The difference was slight, but enough for her to extrapolate the trajectory for the next several hours. She drew more lines around the bowl, connecting marking points that formed a rough track of illumination across the terrain. This helped her visualize where the brightest concentration would fall as afternoon deepened. Around her, the cadets continued to struggle with their rations, muttering complaints under their breath and casting glances toward the distant instructors who pretended not to hear. None of the cadets came closer to Elena now. The brief demonstration with the tuber had startled them enough to give her a wide berth. She did not mind. Solitude made thinking easier. She stood once more and scanned the rocky outcrops surrounding the zone. She noticed that the southern ridge reflected the sunlight downward more intensely than the other ridges, creating a faint spotlight effect that shifted gradually across the land. If she positioned a reflector to catch that natural downward splash, she could amplify it dramatically. With that realization, she walked toward the ridge, leaving her improvised oven behind. As she climbed the uneven rocks, she pressed her palm against the surface and felt the accumulated heat radiating through the stone. The top of the ridge offered an unobstructed view of the entire training area. The sun blazed directly overhead, illuminating everything clearly. She narrowed her eyes and studied how light bounced off the lighter patches of rock, creating faint glimmers across the surface below. Those glimmers were small, inconsistent, and barely noticeable to someone who wasn't analyzing them, but to her they were perfect clues. Every shimmer revealed where natural reflectivity existed. If she could place her own materials in alignment with those glimmers, she could multiply their effect. She took note of the angles of each shimmering patch, crouching to estimate where the strongest focal point might form. She pressed her fingertips together, imagining the point where converging rays would intersect if guided correctly. She remembered diagrams from physics classes and rotated them mentally until they matched what she saw on the ridge. Heat did not concern her. She tolerated high temperatures easily compared to most cadets, and she felt no discomfort under the relentless sun. Instead, she felt energized by the sheer abundance of usable energy around her. The planet was a giant forge without fire, and that reality thrilled her. She climbed down and returned to the clearing, where she began collecting more scraps of reflective foil. She laid them out on the ground and tried different combinations, experimenting with how much curvature she could create using only the poles and strips of fabric. She tested each curve by watching how the sunlight glided across its surface. She adjusted the tension of the fabric supporting the foil to prevent sagging. The process took time, but Elena had always preferred working carefully rather than quickly. She knew that a poorly made reflector would waste precious hours of sunlight, and she refused to allow that kind of inefficiency. As she worked, she noticed subtle changes in the temperature around her. The wind carried heat across the land in uneven bursts, which meant she needed to account for shifting convection currents. A reflector alone would create intense localized heat, but wind could steal that heat away before it reached the food. She tested this by placing her hand above the foil to feel how air moved in response to the concentrated beam. The air trembled visibly, rising in thin waves of distortion. She smiled faintly when she realized she could trap that heated air inside an insulated chamber to create a low-heat, slow-cooking environment. She began sketching another design in the dirt, an enclosed box with a lid made from foil-coated scraps of crate wood, angled precisely to catch the maximum amount of light. Her thoughts moved faster now. The more she studied the star and the terrain, the more confident she became that she could build not one oven, but an entire system of solar cooking tools. One structure could sear, another could bake, another could dehydrate, and another could simmer. The planet's sun offered every temperature range she needed. She stepped into the center of the bowl-shaped area again and lifted her face toward the sky. The sun had shifted slightly from its previous position, and the shadow of her upright pole confirmed the accuracy of her earlier calculations. By this point, several cadets had begun to watch her work again from a distance. One whispered to another, curiosity overcoming discomfort. Elena paid them no attention. She returned to her lines drawn in the dirt and plotted out where each new oven should sit so that the sunlight would land perfectly on their reflective surfaces. She adjusted the markings by dragging her hand across the ground to refine the curves. Every movement she made grew smoother, more assured, as her plan solidified. When she finished marking the placement of the ovens, she stood up and took a slow breath. Behind her, the scent of the cracked tuber lingered faintly in the hot air, but she did not look back at it. The first oven had been a small proof, nothing more. What mattered now was the complete system she envisioned, something far larger, far more ambitious than simply cooking a single meal. She wanted to build a kitchen powered entirely by the star overhead, something the instructors could not forbid because she would follow their rule precisely, without loopholes or deceit. She would simply interpret the environment better than they expected anyone to. She walked toward the far side of the clearing to gather more poles, more foil, and more debris she could repurpose. The sun followed her like a spotlight, fierce and unwavering. With every step, with every new angle she tested, Elena saw the shape of the future meal forming in her mind. She did not yet know what she would cook or how many cadets she would feed, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The ban on fire meant nothing. The planet had given her all the heat she needed. All she had to do was command it. Elena dragged the last bundle of foil sheets toward the center of the clearing, letting the metallic edges scrape across the sun-bleached soil as she moved. The heat no longer felt hostile to her. Instead, it felt like a partner she needed to understand intimately, a force she could mold if she respected its behavior. She placed the bundle beside the markings she had drawn earlier and knelt down, using her shadowless outline as a reference point to position the first frame. Her movements were steady, almost rhythmic, as if she were performing a familiar ritual rather than improvising a design in the middle of a survival trial. She started with the tripod. The poles she had scavenged from broken equipment lay scattered behind her, still warm from lying under the planet's sun. She tested each one by bending it slightly to check if the metal remained sturdy enough to support the weight of the reflective dish she intended to build. Satisfied with the strength of 3 pieces, she drove their pointed ends into the soil, pushing until they formed a triangular stance deep enough to anchor them against the wind. The ground resisted at first, but she pressed harder, using her full weight until the poles sank into the clay beneath the dusty surface. Once they stood upright, she circled them to study the geometry from different angles, adjusting the legs by small increments until the tripod formed a stable base. Next, she unfolded one of the larger sheets of foil, careful not to tear the weakened edges. The material shimmered violently under the direct sunlight, reflecting beams in erratic directions as she stretched it out. She smoothed it against her knee, removing creases with slow strokes of her hand until the surface became a uniform mirror. Then she placed the foil inside the curved piece of scrap metal she had found earlier, pressing it until it conformed to the bowl-shaped structure. The curve was slight, but intentional. She knew from experience that even a shallow dish could concentrate light if angled correctly. Her fingers traced the inner surface, testing for pockets of looseness, and she used fabric strips to secure the foil along the edges, tying knots with deliberate firmness. When the bowl was ready, she lifted it carefully and placed it on top of the tripod. The sunlight caught the reflective interior immediately, creating a piercing flare that pulsed with intensity. Elena shielded her eyes for a moment, then adjusted the tilt by sliding the support beam under the dish into a precise notch she carved into the pole. She stepped away, narrowing her eyes as she observed the line of light forming within the dish. The reflection tightened into a focused spot that grew brighter and hotter as she rotated the dish incrementally. The moment the beam intensified enough to burn a small indentation into the ground beneath it, she allowed herself a quiet, controlled breath of satisfaction. But that was only the beginning. She wanted more than a single beam. She wanted sustained, usable heat. She wanted to create a tool that could replicate the function of a stovetop burner without using any forbidden material. So she gathered small stones from the edge of the clearing and arranged them beneath the tripod to form a shallow ring. She placed a thin layer of flattened metal across the stones to create a platform where food could rest without touching the soil. The metal absorbed heat quickly, darkening at the edges as she experimented with the alignment of the beam. She shifted the dish by a few degrees until the focal point hit the center of the platform, and then she watched as the metal began to smoke faintly. The smell reminded her of sun-scorched tools during her childhood expeditions, and she knew she had achieved the correct intensity. She walked toward the rations she had spread across the ground earlier. The roots and stalks lay in messy piles, some already bruised from the cadets' attempts to chew them raw. She selected a thick root, heavier than the others, and carried it back to the platform. When she placed it at the center, the concentrated beam struck its surface immediately, causing the skin to blister and tighten. She rotated the root slowly with a piece of cloth to prevent burns on her fingers. Steam seeped out in slow wisps, curling upward in slender threads. The scent changed subtly from earthy bitterness to something richer, warmer, and slightly sweet. She watched the transformation with the focused attention of someone memorizing every detail of a crucial experiment. As the root cooked, Elena walked around the reflector to evaluate the consistency of the beam. She crouched on one side, examining how the sun's angle shifted, then rose to adjust the foil in tiny increments, minding the topology of the dish. She wanted the beam to remain stable even as the sun moved, and the shallow curvature helped maintain that steadiness. When she returned to the cooking platform, she tested the tenderness of the root by pressing gently against its side. The outer layer gave way with only slight resistance. She removed it using a strip of cloth as insulation, feeling a small jolt of triumph when she saw the softened interior. The root was fully cooked, and she had done it without a spark. But she did not celebrate. She simply placed the cooked root beside the tripod and began constructing a second dish. This time she aimed for a broader design. Instead of focusing sunlight into a single point, she wanted to bundle it into a large, diffuse glow suitable for baking. She chose a flatter piece of scrap metal and laid the foil across it in long strips, overlapping each one with the precision of someone laying tiles. She fastened the strips with sharpened slivers of wood she carved from broken crate planks. Each sliver pierced the foil at an angle, holding it taut without tearing it. When the surface was fully covered, she shaped it by bending the metal gradually against her knee, forming a wide, shallow curve. The shape reminded her of a solar cooker she had once seen in a documentary, though this version was far more improvised. She positioned the second reflector on the ground using stones as supports instead of poles, then aligned it toward the strongest angle of noon light. When she placed a handful of sliced stalks on a flat metal sheet inside the glowing circle of reflected heat, the pieces began to soften and curl at the edges as the warmth enveloped them. It wasn't as dramatic as the searing beam from the first oven, but it was exactly what she wanted. A gentle and sustained baking effect. With 2 functioning ovens established, Elena moved to the next idea forming in her mind. She wanted to create a heat-retaining chamber, something that could cook slowly over time. She gathered crate boards and arranged them into a rough box shape, then lined the interior with foil so the light would bounce inside instead of escaping. She constructed a lid and angled the top surface with weight from small stones so it would catch sunlight from above. She placed a mixture of chopped roots and stalk fibers inside the chamber, closed the lid, and waited. She knew this oven would take time, but time did not worry her. She had the entire afternoon, and the sun was loyal. As she worked, she sensed movement behind her. Several cadets stood at a distance, staring at the 3 ovens with expressions she could not fully read. Curiosity, confusion, disbelief. They blended together in their faces, but none approached her. She neither acknowledged them nor turned away. Her focus was entirely on the ovens. She watched how each reflected the sun differently, how each created a distinct temperature profile, and how she could combine them to form a complete cooking system. When she finally stepped back to observe all 3 ovens together, she felt a deep and steady satisfaction settle inside her. The clearing had transformed. What had once been an empty patch of land was now a functioning kitchen, powered entirely by sunlight. The instructors had ordered a ban on fire, but they had never banned intelligence, creativity, or the ability to turn an environment into an ally. Elena brushed the dirt from her hands, glanced at the sky to confirm the sun's new position, and prepared to expand the system even more. She was far from finished. The ovens worked, but she had something larger in mind, something that would feed not just her, but every cadet suffering under the weight of the instructor's rule. And she intended to accomplish it before the sun touched the edge of the horizon. Elena wiped her palms against her trousers, leaving faint streaks of dust across the fabric as she stepped back to evaluate the 3 ovens she had assembled. The heat shimmered above each structure, distorting the air into rippling waves that rose and dissolved into the relentless brightness of the sky. She knew she had pushed the designs as far as she could without refining them through practical use. Now she needed to cook something more complex, something that would prove the ovens could deliver consistent results. Her eyes scanned the crates where the instructors had stored the raw rations earlier, and she moved toward them with quiet determination. She opened one crate and lifted a protein slab that had been compressed into a dense block. The surface felt slightly rubbery against her fingertips, but she knew from training that the interior softened beautifully when heated. She carried it toward the searing oven, intending to test how much control she could exert over the beam's intensity. She placed the slab onto the metal platform beneath the concentrated beam. The moment the light struck its surface, a thin layer of moisture sizzled and evaporated, leaving behind a faint, savory scent, reminiscent of lightly grilled meat. She tilted the slab with a strip of fabric, letting the beam scorch one side before flipping it to expose the next. She monitored how quickly the edges crisped and how the interior began to release juices that pooled briefly before evaporating into fragrant steam. A soft gust of hot wind passed through the clearing, carrying the aroma outward. Elena straightened, knowing the scent would draw attention long before she called anyone to her kitchen. She shifted her focus to the baking oven, where the sliced stalks had begun to brown at the edges. She rearranged them gently with a metal stick she had fashioned from a broken hinge. Some pieces curled like delicate petals as they dried, while others softened into a tender consistency that reminded her of roasted vegetables from home. She imagined pairing the crisp pieces with the protein slab, layering flavors that the cadets had likely never experienced together. The idea encouraged her to work faster, not out of haste, but out of excitement. The slow-cooking chamber required more patience. She lifted the lid carefully, allowing a swirl of warm, aromatic vapor to escape. The mixture of chopped roots inside had softened into a paste-like texture, soaking up minerals released by the heat. She stirred it gently, pleased by how evenly the heat had penetrated. The chamber lid closed with a soft thud as she prepared to combine the contents later. As she moved among the ovens, she began envisioning the layout of a proper meal. She retrieved more stalks, chopped them into thin strips, and spread them across the baking oven to create a second batch. She sliced a second protein slab into smaller pieces, arranging them into a spiral pattern beneath the beam so each slice received equal heat. She layered roots into the chamber to create a thicker stew-like base for the eventual feast. Her hands moved with increasing confidence, her thoughts aligning into a plan far more detailed than she had originally intended. The smell intensified. A savory blend of roasted roots, caramelized fibers, and seared protein drifted across the training zone. Elena sensed the cadets before she saw them. Footsteps scuffed the ground behind her as someone approached cautiously. She did not turn. She was focused on removing the first slab from the platform, cooling it with a piece of cloth so she could slice it without burning her fingers. The cooked slab parted easily beneath her improvised knife, revealing a tender interior with a color that looked far more appealing than the raw version. She arranged the slices on a flat metal sheet and let them rest. Only then did she glance over her shoulder. A cadet from the avian species stood a few meters away, his wings folded tightly against his sides, his gaze fixed on the food with restrained longing. Elena nodded in silence, acknowledging him without disrupting her rhythm. She knew more would come now that the aroma had reached the edges of the zone. She placed the second protein slab beneath the beam and adjusted the dish slightly. The sun had shifted, and the beam's focal point drifted by a few centimeters. She corrected the angle with swift precision, anchoring the support beam into a new notch she carved moments earlier. The reflection strengthened immediately. The slab began to sizzle. Another cadet approached, this time from a feline species, moving with hesitant steps. She noticed the way he hovered at the boundary between curiosity and etiquette, unsure if he was allowed to speak or even approach the ovens. Elena gestured toward the sliced slab without looking away from her work. He stepped closer and examined the food as though expecting it to disappear. His expression softened into something close to gratitude, though he said nothing. Elena returned to the baking oven, turning the stalk slices so each crisped evenly. She collected the finished pieces and placed them beside the protein slices. The colors contrasted beautifully, the dark seared edges of the protein against the golden-brown stalk slivers. She knew presentation mattered more than most cadets realized. A carefully arranged meal had the power to restore morale just as effectively as nutrients restored energy. When the slow-cooking chamber released another wave of aromatic steam, she opened it again and stirred the thickened mixture. This time the paste had deepened in color, taking on a rich hue that promised flavor. She scraped it into a shallow metal dish and spread it evenly. The texture resembled a rustic sauce, earthy and fragrant. She placed the dish beside the others to cool slightly before serving. By now, a small gathering of cadets had formed a half-circle around the clearing. No one spoke. No one dared interrupt her. They watched the ovens as though witnessing a ritual they did not fully understand. Some shifted uneasily, torn between hunger and respect. Others leaned forward, mesmerized by the transformation of familiar ingredients into something entirely new. Elena maintained her pace. She cooked the third protein slab, baked another batch of stalk slices, and prepared more roots for the chamber. She moved constantly, adjusting ovens as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Sweat slid down her temples, but her focus did not falter. For her, cooking under these conditions felt natural, almost meditative. When she finally deemed the first spread complete, she arranged everything on a broad metal sheet that she elevated using stones. She knew the cadets needed a signal, something simple and unmistakable. So she stepped back, wiped her hands on her trousers, and nodded toward the food. The avian cadet stepped forward first, hesitating only long enough to glance at her in silent request. Elena inclined her head. He took a small slice of protein and tasted it. His wings unfurled slightly, an involuntary reaction of pleasure. Another cadet stepped forward, then another. Soon the entire group approached, each taking small portions, their expressions shifting from exhaustion and frustration into something softer, almost relieved. As the cadets ate, Elena observed them quietly. She did not smile, but a calm sense of accomplishment warmed her chest. She had not intended to lead anyone. She had simply followed her instinct to solve problems. Yet now she stood at the center of a makeshift camp kitchen, feeding an entire platoon without breaking a single rule. The instructors had positioned themselves on a rocky ledge not far from the clearing. She felt their gaze on her, sharp and unblinking. She did not look in their direction. She did not need to. She knew exactly what this moment meant. She had taken a trial designed to limit her and transformed it into an opportunity to demonstrate something far more powerful than defiance: resourcefulness. She reached for another protein slab, ready to prepare more food, because she knew the cadets would ask for it before hunger returned. The ovens glowed under the shifting afternoon light, their reflective surfaces mirroring the sun's descent. She adjusted the angles once more, her fingers steady, her expression focused. If the instructors wanted to see the limits of human adaptability, she intended to show them something far greater than they had imagined. The feast had only just begun. Elena continued adjusting the ovens as the sun shifted lower, her hands moving with a precision that no longer required conscious calculation. The cadets ate in steady silence behind her, occasionally murmuring to one another in disbelief, but she stayed focused on preparing the second round of dishes. The afternoon heat softened into a deeper amber glow that stretched across the clearing, creating long, slanted shadows behind the ovens. With each shifting degree of light, she refined the angle of the reflectors, ensuring the beam stayed powerful enough to maintain cooking temperatures. The environment felt alive around her, pulsing with warmth and expectation. When she finally stepped away from the ovens to let the second batch cook, she noticed a subtle movement along the rocky ledge. The instructors were descending. The moment had come earlier than she anticipated. She watched them approach with measured composure, her posture steady and balanced. The leading instructor reached the edge of the clearing and paused, letting his gaze sweep across the ovens, the reflective structures, the cooling trays of food, and the cadets gathered with empty dishes in their hands. His expression was difficult to read, neither anger nor approval, but something more complex, something like recalculation. He walked toward the central oven, studying the beam of light that struck the metal platform with controlled ferocity. He extended his hand over the focal point, withdrawing it quickly when the heat stung his palm. He furrowed his brows, then shifted his attention to the baking oven, touching the surface lightly to feel its warmth. His movements carried no hostility, only a deliberate care that suggested his thoughts were several layers deep. Elena remained silent, letting him inspect the constructions without interruption. She did not fear his judgment. She knew the rules as well as he did, and she had followed them more precisely than anyone expected. Another instructor approached the trays of food and examined the sliced protein, the baked stalks, and the thickened root mixture with the same caution a scientist would use when encountering an unfamiliar specimen. He picked up a piece of stalk between two fingers, turned it to observe the crisp edge, and then tasted it. His eyes widened slightly, and he nodded once before stepping aside. Elena recognized the gesture as a restrained form of approval. With the instructor's attention shifting between the ovens and the cadets, Elena stood with her hands behind her back, waiting for the verdict. She knew the meal had created an unspoken unity among the cadets, who now watched the instructor's reactions with a tension that quietly threaded through the group. Even the avian cadet, who had been the first to taste the food, looked conflicted, hopeful but uncertain. Finally, the lead instructor turned toward her. His gaze held a weight that pressed the air around them into stillness. He stepped closer until only a short distance separated them. Elena met his eyes, willing herself to remain calm and unflinching. She refused to betray even a flicker of insecurity. "You built these structures yourself?" he asked, his tone flat but steady. "Yes," she replied, her voice even and grounded. "No fire?" No fire. He shifted his gaze to the concentrated beam again, then back to her. And you cooked an entire meal for the platoon? Yes. A long silence followed. The sun hovered low, casting orange light across the scene. Heat glimmered against the foil surfaces, making the ovens shine like molten artifacts. The cadets waited with bated breath, and Elena sensed the collective tension tightening around her. But she kept her attention solely on the instructor. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled through his nose, as if conceding to something he had not intended to witness during this trial. "You interpreted the rule correctly," he said at last. The words drifted across the clearing, carrying a mixture of surprise and reluctant admiration. One of the cadets let out a small, audible breath of relief. Another lowered his head in a subdued nod. The instructors exchanged glances, silently acknowledging that the trial had taken a direction none of them had predicted. The lead instructor continued. "This exercise was meant to test adherence under constraint. No combustion, no ignition, no cheating through chemical reactions or unauthorized tools." He pointed toward the ovens. "You complied with every requirement, but you also expanded the limits of what the rule allowed." He paused, letting his next words settle firmly into the moment. "You turned a survival restriction into an engineering solution. You provided for your platoon without breaking protocol. You used the environment more effectively than any cadet we have trained in recent seasons." His acknowledgement carried a gravity that resonated through the group. Elena felt the faintest stirring inside her chest, not pride, but a quiet sense of completion, as if a long thread had just reached its final knot. She waited for him to finish. "Your approach demonstrated resilience, adaptability, and leadership," he concluded. "You recognized opportunity where others saw limitation. You solved hunger, improved morale, and upheld discipline all at once." His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "This is the mark of a strategist." The cadet stood straighter at the word. Elena did not react outwardly, but a deep, steady warmth spread through her, more powerful than the sun's heat at midday. The instructor stepped back and addressed the entire group. "The fireless trial is complete. The human cadet has not only passed but redefined the expected parameters of success." He gestured toward the ovens. "These constructions will remain as demonstration models for future trainees, and her results will be incorporated into our academy archives." Elena felt her breath catch quietly, not out of shock but out of understanding. She had not just completed a task. She had contributed something lasting. Her work would outlive the trial itself. The instructors dismissed the group shortly after, allowing the cadets to finish whatever remained of the food. Some approached her hesitantly, offering small words of thanks. The avian cadet bowed his head respectfully before stepping away, and the feline cadet placed his hand briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of gratitude without fanfare. Elena accepted each acknowledgement with quiet composure. When the sun dipped lower and the sky deepened into a darkening blend of orange and purple, Elena dismantled the smallest oven to collect the remaining scraps of foil. She left the two main ovens intact, as instructed. She brushed dust from her hands and looked out across the ridge where the instructors had once stood. The world felt wider now, as if the atmosphere itself had shifted in response to what she had accomplished. As she walked away from the clearing, she understood something quietly profound. She had not set out to make a statement or to impress anyone. She had simply refused to accept a boundary that existed only in the minds of those who feared creativity. She had taken a rule meant to confine her and transformed it into an opportunity to display something essential about her nature, the human instinct to solve, adapt, and elevate. The trial had ended, but its conclusion unfolded far deeper than a simple pass or fail. She had shown the instructors that ingenuity flourished in constraint. She had shown the cadets that limitation did not have to mean suffering. And she had shown herself that no environment, no rule, no circumstance could diminish the quiet force inside her that moved her toward solutions. As the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the horizon, Elena allowed herself a single moment of stillness. It was not triumph she felt, nor even relief, but something steadier, a grounded certainty that she belonged in this academy, not because of raw strength or alien physiology, but because she carried a skill the others had yet to understand fully. She walked back toward camp with her head high, the cooling wind brushing against her skin. The day had tested her creativity, her resolve, and her restraint. She had answered each test with precision and calm. And as the stars emerged in the deepening sky, she knew one truth with unwavering clarity.